So also, just to give a little bit of background on this theme, this is a topic that came out from the community of practice calls that we were all having together with me and all of you guys, you grantees. And this topic of what does it mean to really support resident leadership? We've been referring to this thing we call the power ladder a lot, which has a ladder and community members. And we've been looking a lot throughout this Community Catalyst project on where do community members lie on this ladder of power. And at the very bottom, folks are clients or victims at the worst case scenario, moving up to be, sort of giving input on programs to information sources, and then maybe partners. And then at the very top of the ladder, we have in control and really driving community efforts and projects. And on our last community of practice call, everyone really felt that they were doing well at getting up the rung to kind of that second to top rung, but that last one where community members were really in control and that working as institutional representatives and staff, we were more in a supportive role for them. That was what everyone was kind of agreeing was a challenge. How do we do that? How do we practically get there? So this was in response to that, that conversation. So we have these wonderful guests with us here today, Tim and Lisa and John, who have some stories and some examples of the work that they've done and they've been doing to really make that shift so that they're standing constantly in a role of support to community members and residents to really drive their own change and take charge of that. So, and also the photo that I chose for this, the two photos I chose, one is by our good friend and other faculty member, Jim Deers, of a citizen-driven initiative to reduce emissions and improve climate change situations. And they came up with all these wonderful experiments and projects and really made a difference. And then on the right-hand side is a picture of a ship in a very tumultuous sea. And I just chose those two pictures because I think when we first talk about getting out into community, we can feel like that ship, and the community is just, it could be so lonely, and sometimes it's very new, if we've been spending more of our time within the world of organizations or our own organization. And it can just be, it can be like this giant crazy sea and it's always changing, right? But it's an adventure. And when we actually get out there, we end up having a lot of fun. So that's what that other picture was meant to try to convey. So it doesn't have to be scary. So again, welcome Lisa, Tim, and John. So I wanted to pull up real quick just to set the tone for the goals that you guys said you wanted to get out of this webinar. These are from the survey that most everyone filled out. So just wanted to show that real quick. Folks said that they wanted to learn about how to step forward after having stepped back if the community struggles to engage or grow the capacity to serve the community and meet needs. When does an interested organization lead? When a leadership void exists? Another one was how to strike the balance between leading and empowering community members, and then navigating competing needs while aiming to lead by stepping back at the same time. Then we have moving forward while dealing with groups or affiliations that may be at war. How to tactfully keep people in the loop or show that they are valued and still move forward with your work. Then the power dynamics that exist between our institutions, museums, and their collections were founded on colonial systems of knowledge and looting. And the communities that we are working with, many of whom have been negatively impacted by our very existence. Real talk. And then current strategies being implemented, what has been found to be successful, what has also found to not be successful, and lessons learned. And then just I'm really concerned and interested in the main question of the webinar. So we are definitely going to be, all of the presentations are geared towards answering these goals of yours. And we will start by welcoming Lisa to share your story.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us today, and thanks to April for rounding us all up, and I'm in esteemed company with John and Tim, so I want to thank them also for doing that. So mine is really a story, and if you'll notice the time frame, this was approximately a span of 12 years. Nothing happens fast, and what I've learned over several decades of work in ABCD now is that it truly ebbs and flows, and just understanding that some years when I was working in the neighborhoods, it was on fire, and other years people sort of stepped back and had other things going on in their lives, and just to go with the ebb and flow and just join that particular rhythm of the neighborhood and enjoy it. So my work primarily centers in Saginaw, Michigan, and I had a small nonprofit called Healthy Community Partners, and in 1997, the hospital, St. Mary's of Michigan, asked us if we would partner with them to just work in the neighborhood, because they just felt like they couldn't reach anybody. And I know one of the things April asked us to talk about were some of the barriers. And so in the picture that you see, the Saginaw River is a real barrier in Saginaw, Michigan. On one side is the west side, and that's the wealthier side, and on the other side is the east side. And the river truly serves as not only a physical barrier, but it was a psychological barrier, and nobody would ever cross the river to go to the east side, because that was not the neighborhood that people really wanted to be in at that time. So anyway, the story is the hospital wanted us to just work with neighbors and try to break down barriers and become friends or serve them in any way that we could. The other barrier was that because it's a tertiary care hospital, it's a trauma center, burn, cancer, heart center, people looked at the hospital as that is where you go to die. So, you know, between the river and the hospital, and in 1997, the FBI had just named Saginaw, Michigan, the most dangerous city in the country. There were a lot of perceptions about this neighborhood. So we had our small nonprofit, and they asked us, the hospital said, you know, see if we can build some bridges with the neighborhood. And so the first thing we did was we hired neighbors, of course. And we hired about 2 or 3 people, and it was at that time I was starting to read John McKnight's work about ABCD, and I realized that I was truly clueless about how to engage in a way that would be positive and beneficial for neighbors, and not me or the hospital as much. And so my entire board of directors and my staff and I went to Chicago for a day, and John met us at the airport and schooled us in ABCD. And so not only were the policy people on board, the board of directors, but the staff, you know, we're day-to-day operations. We were on board, and we really started our ABCD journey. So we went back, and of course we started attending the Cathedral District neighborhood meetings, and just began to listen. And a lot of people asked for helpful hints, and I have to tell you, there's no magic. It was really just being present, being respectful, listening to people. The equation is up there: consistency over time equals trust. Showing up, being present, being a good listener. And we really committed time to be in the neighborhood, getting out of the office. Yes, we had a lot of paperwork, and we reported to the hospital, and we had the data side of our lives, but the real joy in our lives was just interacting with the neighbors and going to the neighborhood association meetings and being involved in their activities. So the whole idea of be a neighbor first, you know, we're all professionals, and we all have funders and grantees and organizations we report to, but we really learned to just put that aside and be a neighbor first, and commit to going into the neighborhood as much time as possible and show up where the neighbors gather. And so after a time, they began welcoming us and realized that the hospital really did want to be a friend and an encourager of their activities, and they began to trust us over time. And so we started talking about some of the ABCD tools like asset mapping and capacity inventories, and I'll just never forget the day we talked about capacity inventories. The neighbors said, we want to do that. We want to do that. That sounds really cool. And I said, you know, why do you want to do a capacity inventory? And they said, because no one's ever asked us what we can do. They only ask us what we can't do, and they label us. And so they really, really got into doing capacity inventories. And so over time, we would do capacity inventories at social events and gatherings and neighborhood meetings. And the purpose of the capacity inventory is not for us to administer it, but the neighbors wanted, first of all, to design their own capacity inventory. We showed them samples, but they crafted one they felt was specific to their neighborhood. And then we would go out in teams and they would interview and talk to each other. So they would meet with somebody that they didn't know. And usually we were in groups, in social groups. And it was really fun. As people had never met each other before, one of their goals was to reduce isolation and alienation. So we're at these community events and everybody's talking to somebody they don't know. And honest to God, after a while, it sounded like a family reunion. They were boisterous and having fun and talking and laughing. And you would never have known that a half hour ago, none of these people had ever met each other. So they started to say, well, what block do you live on? Well, I live over here. And oh, I've walked by that house. That's a neat house. And it really generated less fear, isolation, and sort of a neighborhood camaraderie. And because they started knowing each other by their, you know, gifts, talents, and skills and what they could do, where they lived, what their interests were, it really shifted over time their reality. It really shifted their language and how they started to describe themselves. Instead of using, you know, data points from actuaries and census in all the negative deficiency language, they started talking about the McDonald's sign, you know, that used to say we've sold over 1 billion hamburgers. They would say we've identified 6,982 gifts, talents, and skills in our neighborhood. We are rich, we are abundant. And it just shifted their perception of themselves. So by doing that, we were able to support them, be a resource, and facilitate some of their events and help them out. But they really took the lead, and I'll never forget. And then I'm going to flip to the next slide. 2 years of this, I had to report out to the St. Mary's Hospital Board of Directors, which is a big high-powered group in mid-Michigan. And they said, what's your big outcome? And they're all excited and waiting with bated breath. And I said, I think the neighbors trust us now. And they said, that's your outcome? And I said, yes. I said, now we can start getting some work done. So I think that was very enlightening for the hospital as well. So one of the things that came out of the capacity inventory was that we found out a lot of people, even though they were unemployed or laid off, because this is right when General Motors shut down a lot of its plants in Flint and Saginaw, and just people were unemployed and hurting and couldn't get work. But we found out there was so much expertise and know-how in the neighborhood, so that people started connecting by their gifts. So the people that knew how to garden would get together, and we helped them do this. The people that knew how to cook, we had like 15 retired high school cooks who really knew how to cook. We had people who could love to do lawn care. We had people that were just ace mechanics. And so once you get them together by their passions, not their deficiencies, they start saying, oh, we want to do this and we want to take on that project. And so we had people doing neighborhood cleanups. We had people doing community gardens, people putting on social events and cooking for it because they were connected by their strengths. And what happened is people got so good at this, they started small businesses. So we had the Hearts with Hammers group. They did home rehab. And we had Stacy's Tasties. They started a catering business. And the hospital was so impressed with this that we were connecting the hospital, and they started contracting with these small neighborhood businesses for when the hospital had to go out and host a community event, they would hire the local catering folks from the neighborhood to provide the food. So after a while, so many small businesses started to emerge, everything from braiding to doing nails to just helping people learn to cook, quilt, so whatever it was, that the neighborhood became an economic hub. And because of that, people started contracting with folks in the neighborhood, or bartering or swapping or sharing, and it just continued to shift the power dynamic in the neighborhood as a place of wisdom, authority, a place that had value, and just a lot of know-how and expertise. And if you wanted to get something done, you would contact the neighborhood association, and they would connect you to all the experts in our neighborhood. So it really helped with business development and entrepreneurial. And then if you want to go to the next slide. Then on top of that, of course, because we were in healthcare and we were partnering with a hospital, and many people on my board of directors were nurses and physicians and other health professionals, we really tried to look at how could we apply ABCD principles to healthcare and public health outreach. So we started, we'd had a really good partnership with a local university. So we had teams of medical students and nursing students go out with neighbors and just have conversations with other neighbors and capture what assets create and sustain health. Of course, we have a lot of data on public health indicators and the leading diseases, the top 10 reasons for death, and the prevalence of disease in that part of Michigan, but nobody knew what actually kept people healthy. So we focused on the asset-based side, what keeps people healthy. And when we started to find out what people did, and we found out that there were all kinds of walking clubs, and people would get together and walk in a local park, and they had already set times for the geriatric group and the youth group and the early risers, and then people would get together and have informal cooking sessions, and people would teach other people how to harvest things out of the community garden. So we started collecting all that information, and we created brochures and flyers, and the neighbors distribute those back out to the physicians' local offices and management and practices, and said, if you have patients that need these kinds of services to benefit their health, we can plug them into our neighborhood healthy habits. And I think the medical community was really impressed with that, and they began to see that we were serious about improving health status. So we started to really, again, over time, this is about the 4th or 5th year, be seen as a place where people could really identify health practices. And in exchange for that, we were able to get, this is before the Affordable Care Act, patients, I should say neighbors, into medical homes, primary care medical homes, and they would take people that didn't have insurance. So that proved to be a boon also to health, to have people have access to primary care. In addition to that, what also came out of that, asking people what creates and sustains health, is once we started to put together what that looked like and what those assets looked like that kept people healthy, we put them roughly into the categories of the social determinants of health, or the determinants of health, you know, everything from individual lifestyles, social support systems, environmental factors. I could spend a lot of time on that because we're in a neighborhood that had Dow chemical trains running through the middle of it. So later on, if the gentleman who's doing work in environmental things wants to contact me, that would be fine. But what we did was found out that every 6 months, the teams would come back, report to the neighborhood, our nursing students and medical students and our neighbors, and they would report back what the determinants of health are looking like. And so the neighbors started tracking that. And over 10 years, we were able to see what determinants of health are most prevalent, which ones are working, which ones do we need to work on a little bit more. So in effect, the health department was very interested in this and realized that the neighborhood was surveillance. They were conducting public health surveillance methodologies. And so we began reporting out to them. And again, it continued to raise the neighborhood in the eyes of the community and the city. And because it was a food desert, you can see some pictures of here. The farmer's market was located on the riverfront. If you saw the picture of the river I showed you at the beginning, that really becomes key, and that becomes instead of a barrier, one of the key assets to redevelopment in the neighborhood. So if you want to keep going, April, let me know when I'm a few minutes before I need to be done here. So
we've got about 3 minutes.
okay, good. So very quickly, some of the short and long-term results is that the capacity inventories early on in the first several years really became a hallmark for change and really shifted not only the internal perception of the residents, but the outside perception of the area. And the entire city, once the neighbors started taking civic action, they wanted to go report out at city council. This is what's going on in our neighborhood. These are our assets. That really sort of woke people up to the possibilities. And then medical specialists realized, hey, I can locate and build buildings in this neighborhood and connect with the hospital. So now we have the Michigan Cardiovascular Institute is across the street. They built a large building on the riverfront right across from the hospital. And when they did that, we as the neighborhood association asked them if they would let us use their conference rooms for meetings and their facilities. And they said, absolutely, we love it. So they let us do that. Meanwhile, the hospital funded and brought in a gas station and a small grocery store, because on the east side there was no grocery store, no gas station, there were no services or amenities for the neighbors. So the city of Saginaw is waking up and going, wow, all this cool stuff is happening in this forgotten neighborhood. We need to be a part of this. And so they started putting in more lights and fixing some of the broken lights and filling the potholes in the road and just making it easier for people to get around. They upped the public transportation and bus services and really became a partner. And then when they had interns come into the city, they would send them to our neighborhood to learn how to partner with residents using asset-based approaches. So the neighborhood became a major evaluator using this. It was similar to a participatory action, but primarily just using their own terms and voices and knowledge and showing people how they could really uplift and demonstrate their own authority and leadership. And of course, out of this, people emerged, our indigenous and informal leaders emerged who really took this over. And the neighborhood became so recognized as the hot spot of ABCD. And we didn't know anybody else in Michigan, except for some Detroit neighborhood groups that were doing this, that our neighborhood folks became trainers and went out to the other neighborhoods in Saginaw and started them on their ABCD journey. And of course, the public and private investors continued to focus on the riverfront. And then eventually our neighbors, the gentleman in the first slide that you saw, I think, or the second slide, he became a city commissioner and then eventually became the mayor of Saginaw, and now he serves on the county commission, and his next step is to run for state rep. So this was 12 years. It took a lot of time. There's a lot of bumps in the road, but it's now seen and recognized as one of the best ABCD examples in Michigan. And so I want to thank John and everybody for all their help and work over the years. It's been a journey. And so now I'm in a medical school and I'm doing similar work with our medical students out in communities. So I'm transferring it more to an institutional setting. How am I doing, April?
That's great. That's fantastic. What a great story. Thank you so much, Lisa. Oh, you've got more photos.
Oh, this is just getting out of the office. Yeah, just real quickly, pictures, the neighborhood meeting, picnic, first annual picnic. We had over 600 people, and everyone said, no, you can't do that. You can't have it. That'll, something violent's going to happen. And I said, no, it's not. And we had an absolute blast. The second picture is, a lot of people didn't know how to cook and bake, and so all of our bakers and cooks got together and hosted a giant Christmas cookie baking festival every Christmas, and they would be paired with some of the kids in the neighborhood and show them how to use rolling pins and measuring cups, and we'd make like 3,000 or 4,000 Christmas cookies, and every child took home a big platter of Christmas cookies for Christmas. In the lower left, there's Jeff and Bakari. Jeff was one of our neighbors, and he became the president of the neighborhood association. And Bakari was one of our top ABCD trainers in the other neighborhoods. And then in the bottom right, you can see a lot of this also happens sitting around the table, being a neighbor, having coffee, and just talking about ABCD with neighbors. So out of the office.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Awesome. So now we're going to switch over to Tim. And Tim, I'm going to pull up your presentation. Give me just 1 second. And that should show for everyone. Is everyone seeing the Starfire screen? Okay, I'm going to assume that's a yes. Lisa and John, are you seeing the Starfire?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, Tim.
Cool. Thanks, April. It's an honor to be on. I also would identify with Lisa's experience of being schooled by John early on.
Yeah.
He showed up to Cincinnati with Peter Block, who actually lives here, and Judith Snow, and Peter got up in front of an audience that I had attended and said, there's better stories to Cincinnati than Marge Schott and Pete Rose and all the problems. And then John got up after him and said, beware of people that are profiting off of other people's problems. And then Judith got up and said, there's no such thing as disability. This is all a social construct. And I left thinking, these hippies have blown apart my worldview. And I am now, my life is over as I know it. So John schooled us that night as well with his cohorts. But it was a blessing. I think our story at Starfire is one of thinking about the competing needs of to survive as an organization as we were, instead of thinking about how to survive as human beings. So as we go through this, we'll be thinking about that. It's interesting to think about the ladder analogy too. I think that we actually just had our ladder leaned up against the wrong wall. We were climbing the wall of ambition and corporate nonprofit achievement. And it wasn't climbing the ladder of together, of community, of family. So we've just shifted the wall that we're climbing, to use the ladder analogy. Our organization supports people with disabilities. April, if you click through next slide, you'll see a couple of the outings that we did. We'd take people with Down syndrome to pumpkin patches, have dances for hundreds of people with disabilities. That's me in a Santa Claus suit with a bunch of people with disabilities next. And then you kind of see the Halloween parties at the nursing home, or the trip to the fire station, or the trip to Disney World. Going out to eat. These were outings, 6 people with disabilities, staff, a volunteer from the community, and potentially, you know, a mom or dad might show up as well. But it was all based on the identity of disability being the common kind of theme. As we were kind of interrupted by John's visit, I was in particular, I was the director in 2009 when he swung through town. And I had been the director for about 4 years. We'd raised somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 million for a building and a bunch of vans and things like that. And we also were interrupted by this graph that April's going to get up here for us. Next, there you go. So this graph was something that we learned about some local research. A guy named Jack Peeler interviewed 51 people with disabilities in about 1991. He asked the question, who's in your life? And what he found was, on average, about each person had 8 family members. Each person had about 25 paid human service professionals, people like us, Special Olympics, special education, group home workers, Goodwill, workshop workers, etc. Each person had about 2 people with friends without disabilities in their lives, and each person had about 3 other citizens without disabilities in their lives. And then each person had about 68 other people with disabilities in their lives. So what we kind of saw was this idea of social segregation, that if you look at the north and south quadrants, you got family and citizens. It's a very empty space. If you look at the east and west quadrants, you'll see it's full of paid people and other clients. So we were confronted by this chart. One, we were complicit in it. We were the people who were paid to take out a group of the clients, right? And then we heard families say, well, I don't have any clue who's going to be around when I'm gone to take care of my loved one. People with disabilities saying, who's going to take my life seriously? Who's going to be there for my 21st birthday? Who's going to be there to, stand up for me at my wedding or whatever? The typical life experience of relationship just wasn't there. we considered that a social problem in our outings, our big fancy day programs where we were training people for social skills and how to vote and tie their shoes. None of that was getting at this loneliness, this inability to have someone to reach out to. And it also just was kind of replicating a weird kind of segregated pattern of my problems define who I hang out with, where I live, where I work, who's my friends, who am I allowed to talk to. And lastly, this paid world is kind of weird because these are us and we have a lot of power over people's lives. We hold the planner, we hold the money, we hold the van keys. So everything that we dictated people do, they basically did. It might be, do you want to go bowling on the west side or the east side? Do you want to eat hamburgers or do you want to eat chicken? It was never really what you want to become. What was your purpose, right? We didn't even realize that anything that we did was wrong or anything that we did was even remotely outside the bounds of anything other than look at those awesome social workers who are so committed and amazing. So we are so full of pride in our work, and we just had no clue that it could be perpetuating any kind of injustice. But these questions really bothered us. Next slide, please, April. These are some of the questions that confronted us. Is this just us? Where did this come from? How did we ever get here? Is our business model perpetuating an injustice? Am I a bad person? Did we waste all our time here? Is there a better story? And what's my responsibility? Those are all the things that just kind of popped up for us. But I wanted to focus in particular on this couple questions here. So if we could go next, April. I think one of the things I wonder is, where else do we see this pattern is in the disability story? So we quickly were able to see that it's part of special education. It's part of Special Olympics. It's part of the social assumptions of where people with disabilities belong. And it creates this from birth, essentially, through therapies and school on through adulthood. It creates the assumption, creates a reality. And then that reinforces the assumption. So all of a sudden, it's the pattern for people with disabilities. The other interesting thing is this pattern actually to us looks like a lot of other segregated kind of marginalized people. So it ends up looking like a nursing home. It ends up looking like a poverty initiative. It looks like an addiction clinic. It looks like a school. It looks like a homeless shelter. We started to realize that a lot of our world's built on this thing that John pointed out after I overcame my shock and anger at him and I read the Careless Society and realized that our world is built upon, some people are marginalized, sent away, and the rest of us are paid to take care of them. So it was a pattern that we see in a lot of other places other than disability. So we decided to blow up our organization. And April, if we could go next, that'd be great. And what we ended up doing was focusing in on the, and one more, yeah, there we go. We focused in on the idea that each person had a unique purpose. We could help people discover that. And then we could ungroup them, them, and help each person develop their own life and their own story and set of friendships and relationships. So what we ended up framing this as is this theory U. So I'm not sure if anybody's familiar. I know April is, but theory U is a change theory. And if you skip next, it'll say something that at any point in time, up at the top of the left hand of the U there, that's where we are now. And the top of the arrow over on the right-hand side is where we want to be. It could be next month, it could be in 10 years, it could be in 100 years. But we know that it takes two things. One, in order to get to that better place, we've got to let go of the old story. We've got to realize that our kind of social segregation was in the way of people with disabilities stepping into full citizenship and full kind of purposeful lives. So that's kind of a hospice effort. We kind of help think about it. You have to be respectful and let the thing die. And it's not going to go overnight. As Lisa said, 12 years. Our story was 9 years and still continues in many ways. So letting something go takes a long time. But to do it gently and respectfully and understanding it was a relic of the past. It came out of, for example, our efforts came out of a desire to be better than the institutions of the 60s and 70s, and their efforts came out of a desire to be better than then atrocities like genocide and, you know, eugenics movements and the Holocaust. So we really are trying to do better. Unfortunately for us, we think that there's a wholesale change that needs to shift. That's the leaning the ladder against the other wall. We don't think that it's a nudge, that there's a fundamental mindset about who's broken and who's not, who belongs and who doesn't. So the other thing is the inventing. You have to bring forth the new story. You have to kind of birth the baby. If you flip through a little bit now, April, one more. I'll name a few of the things that we had to let go of. We had to let go of the idea of ourselves as caretakers. Institutional caretaking is a big kind of assumption that it's our job to take care of these people. The idea then became that we had to embrace instead being connectors. So that meant we had to hire different staff. We had to go from people who were social workers and special ed majors and that kind of skill set to people that were salespeople and artists and creatives, you know. If you scroll down next, April, you'll see a picture of Cashel. She has a disability. She lives in what would be known as the most dangerous neighborhood in Cincinnati. Somebody came here and said, "Where should I not go tonight?" We'd say Lower Price Hill. Cashel got kicked out of Goodwill, her sheltered workshop, and she and I consider that a badge of honor. She was having bad behavior, but she was being paid $7 a week there. You know, I would have bad behavior too if I were labeled and segregated by my disability and getting paid $7 a week. So Cashel gets kicked out, and we said, well, why don't we do something in her neighborhood? So she and her 52 neighborhoods of Cincinnati launched the Cincinnati Olympics, beer stein competitions, and tug of wars. Each neighborhood had a captain. Cashel was in charge of the neighborhood Jenga in her neighborhood, so she had to share all the word. From that kind of role of little project, she started working with the artists in her neighborhood, and they started to put these, I wish this vacant building was, and they'd put markers out and people would put their dreams on the vacant buildings. Go ahead and skip ahead. A year ago, Cashel was named an artist in residence in her neighborhood, and she's gotten herself a stipend and now is mentoring other artists in that neighborhood today. So again, what you notice is if we connect her to her neighbors, she becomes something new. We had to let go of the idea of programs as structure and step into open source or values. So anything can fit in our new values. Go ahead and skip April 2. We use John O'Brien's 5 valued experiences that everybody needs to share typical places and make choices and make contributions and experience respect and grow in relationships. This is really crucial because what we were relying on for structure before was program design. You sign up for these outings, you learn this curriculum, you are taught these skills, you go here 4 days a week, you know, so we relied on those kinds of structures. These values, including asset-based community development, hold us more accountable than we ever dreamed back then. Go ahead and skip forward. We also let go of our old, one more. We started to learn all these new things. So I listed them all out here: social role valorization, the 5 valued experiences. You'll see John's name down there with ABCD, and Peter Block's small group technique. There's just so many different things that we learned, and we discovered there's lots of ways to think about this that are better than the ways that our ancestors in the work did. And it's incumbent upon us to let go of our own institutional structure. To put it again, if we want to survive as an organization, it can't come at the expense of human beings with disabilities and their families and their potential, if that makes sense. Go ahead and skip us forward there, April. So we also let go of kind of our faith in systems as the answer, that we don't think a Medicaid thing is going to solve anything. We don't think that, you know, a nonprofit or a foundation is going to figure everything out, that the answer has to lie in people. So if you zoom in there, April, the next one is a picture of Michelle, who loved to write terrible Harry Potter fan fiction. Draco and Hermione were doing awful things to each other. And we thought, well, how's that a gift? So we gathered a bunch of women together, and they did a little journal project where they would leave a journal in every cafe in the city. And it would have a prompt. What's a secret? When was your first kiss? Who have you not talked to that you wish you could make amends with? And then they collect this journal every 2 weeks, and they'd come together and read from it to each other. And they'd write and reflect on that. So that's been going on now for 5 years. Previously, Michelle would have been stuck with Cashel in a workshop getting paid $7 a week. right? Next. Here's a picture of Candace. She is starting, well, helped start the Warrior Moms Project, giving makeovers to single moms. Go ahead, skip ahead. This is Michael, who brewed beer with the guys from Mad Tree, which is a local brewery. And he brewed with another brewery called 50 West. The three of them kind of collaborated. And Michael now works at both those places. His life is not about Down syndrome. It's about stouts and porters and pilsners and stuff like that. And it's fascinating to think about, but he could be doing the buddy walk, or he could be doing toileting training his whole life and would never have discovered that his actual purpose was to chug a lift at the end of his shift and get in the cab and go home, you know. Next. And then you've got Doug, who works at the Contemporary Arts Center. We attached a GoPro to his wheelchair, and now he collects footage of all the new art exhibits being installed, and they send that out with a script to all their fancy pants donors. So the idea is that Doug and Candace and Michelle, and they would all been in our program. Skip ahead if you would, please. And the only thing tying them together here was their disability. What actually knits them with their circles that you just saw is the love of writing, the love of fashion, the love of, you know, art. And so we had let go of our buildings and started to step into neighborhoods. We don't think inclusion should have an address. We don't think art should have an address. We don't think veterans should have an address. We don't think that homeless people, I mean, everybody has to have their own place. It can't live at our building, right? But that was tough. Institutionally, we think we ought to own buildings and vans, and we think we got to be the center of things, and we got to send out an annual report with all of our reports about it, and we got to own these stories, right? But it's not sustainable. Please skip ahead, Harry. We had to let go of ourselves, and our middle management was creating a big need to segregate people. So the more that we had middle managers kind of solving problems, we had to group people with disabilities together. That created more problems for the middle managers to solve. We had 150 incidents to report to the state of Ohio each year when we had groups of people in our building. After we made the shift to just community, we have 0. So people, there's less of the violence that people are experiencing, or the confusion or the hurts with each other, and more attention to their personal lives and safety. Skip ahead. We had to let go of the idea that this is about fixing people. Instead, it's about healing the culture that makes their lives hard. So then we had to elevate the people with disabilities that we work with into the kind of partnership with us, that all of a sudden now they are no longer clients, they're partners, they are connectors. So we had our staff have to study all kinds of new things like mindfulness and asset mapping in neighborhoods and design thinking and things like that. So again, you're trying to create a better culture for everybody, and that people who are marginalized, the point isn't to make them fit into the bad culture, the point's to partner with them in creating the better culture. We discovered, skip ahead, April, that what heals is these trauma resilience factors, new patterns over time. We need to do everything every Tuesday, every third Sunday, every other month, every Saturday morning. We have to do it with other people. It can't just be alone. It has to remind us of our strengths and reflect our purpose, and it has to engage our senses so we kind of get it into our sense memory, into our bodies. So all of our projects, if you notice, the taste of the beer, the sound of the written word as you read the journals, the feel of the makeup going onto people's faces. We're constantly trying to create new memories in people's bodies that pull us all out of the traumatizing culture that we've created together that is especially acutely hurtful to people with disabilities. Skip ahead. We let go of their ideas. Clients have stepped into citizens. Who is responsibility for culture? Who is the community builder? Who else can join us in that? So we need more partners, not more programs. Go ahead, April. We let go of the idea that our work was professional and was stuck in the 9 to 5. We started to take our work home with us and realize that here we are getting paid to help people with disabilities, and we go home and put our feet up and abandon our neighborhood, and there'd be people with disabilities on our block that we didn't even know. So there was a disconnect, and we started to wonder, what the hell are we doing if we're getting paid to do this and then treating this as though it's a bank job, right? And that was really kind of a seduction that we had to notice and say, it's time for us to start figuring out how to do this 5 to 9 as well, how to do this on the weekends and in our own neighborhoods and hearts. So we had to really kind of ask that question. And what we noticed was the system can't always help, that we actually had better solutions at home that we would then bring back to work and say, okay, well, we learned in our neighborhood that it was better to start a potluck than it was to start a program. And so we'd help people start potlucks. Next slide, please. We got rid of defined outcomes and let emergence happen. So the idea is, Joe, hey, we have no idea. Joe's just interested in history. So we sat down and planned what all that could that be. And all of a sudden it turned into the 6th annual historical reenactment of the founders of Cincinnati. And Joe and his whole family are involved, and they have a canon guy, and they have the Dulcimer Society. And he's got about 40 people that show up every year now as actors, and then hundreds of people that show up as experiencing the reenactment. Joe's life was defined by disability. It's now defined as a history nerd, right? But we didn't know that at first. We just knew that he was kind of liked history. And then we saw what came out of it in conversations, interviews, asset-based kind of mapping kind of exercises. Next. We had to let go of the idea that people are consumers and step into the idea that they are creators. If you look next, you'll see Margot's story. She started a storytelling festival. After that is Nick. He got into metaphysics, and he's autistic, but he also does dream interpretation. I remember him saying, call around 2 a.m. We'll be there. We'll answer the phones. And people did that, you know. But that's his purpose. He shares it with a lot of other people. It's no different than my Catholic voodoo, but it's, got its own brand of crazy. Next, you'll see that we gave up on serving everyone. An institutional idea is that we must fix every single person we possibly can. Instead, we said, what about the people that are attracted to this? Who are the people that really want this? Let's build a movement by going with the energy, as opposed to forcing everybody, or forcing ourselves rather to be milquetoast, to be a big compromise. You know, I mean, if I wanted to take 6 random people with disabilities out and make them happy, I could probably hit a home run with McDonald's. But McDonald's isn't writing, it's not fashion, it's not beer brewing, right? So it's actually about being less efficient and more intentional with our time and our resources. Go ahead and skip next. That brought up a lot of stuff within us. Again, institutionally, we thought that we had to say yes to everybody. So parents would say, oh my gosh, you're going to help me with 3 hours a week with Doug at his job at the Contemporary Arts Center, but he still has 37 hours a week. And we used to feel bad about that. And then we realized that if we said yes to the 40 hours, we would say no to the 3 hours. And then Doug's purpose gets lost in this idea that his whole life has to be delegated to us. So we'd set limitations. We'd say, we're only working in this neighborhood. We're only going to work these many hours a week. Go ahead and skip forward, please, April. And skip again. And one more time. We let go of the idea that it was about 40 hours, that instead this is about 40 years. We have to figure out, how do you help a person have a best friend when they're 50? And that means that you have to help them have a best friend when they're 49 and they're 48 and 47 and on back to the very moment when a friendship begins. And that if we didn't help those friendships get started, the clock would never stop ticking, that we couldn't get to a 40-year relationship where people were connected with each other. So we have to work every single day and plant trees that we may never see them come to fruition, you know. Next. We had to let go of the idea of walking out. When we discovered how big this change was going to come, it was super tempting to just say, too much. And it really was, in a lot of ways, to give up all these institutional mindsets. It's literally undoing everything that we've been conditioned to think represents a successful business. And instead we said, well, if we leave, then the people who be left in this institutional bullshit will still be here in 10 years. And we'll have the privilege of doing that. But it's not really fair because they don't have that privilege. So we decided to stay. And we gave up our own comfort and we sat doing things that we knew weren't really great for 10 years in order to shepherd people out of it alongside them. So there are about 7 staff that stayed through of the original 35, and including myself, to make sure that we got it done. Next slide. And we also discovered that this was not about shaming the old. And this is really important. While we think that the institutional mindset of community services and helping people has to go, it has to die, that's the part of the letting go that's about hospice, gentle and respectful. It's not that these are Hitlers or bad people that set all this stuff up. I know because I was them. It's just people that were just basing their assumptions and their efforts off of old kind of patterns. So we said, let's be easy on ourselves. Let's be easy on our colleagues. Let's be as easy as we can on families and people with disabilities who let us down. Be easy on the system and funders and the community who hasn't stepped up yet. Let's be easy on our ancestors who never told us about this or knew about it, right? If you could skip next. So what got in the way was judgment and cynicism and fear. Go ahead and zoom in on that, April. Next. And if we stopped and judged ourselves or judged other people, we would have never moved. We couldn't be cynical. Well, sure, we saved, time for 100 people with disabilities. There's still 9,900 in Hamilton County and Cincinnati. But if we just let those 9,900 get in the way of helping the 100, we'd never have moved. And if we were worried about getting fired or being, told that we were breaking rules, we would have never done it either. So we had to move past those things mindfully. Next. And the things that helped were that we learned as much as we could. We had prototypes. We tried a little bit here and there. We had allied mentors, and I think the term allied really matters. You have to have people that are on the side of the future, not people that are sitting there saying, well, you might want to really be careful and run that by your lawyer, it's kind of like, oh, no, this is important. We're just going to go ahead and do this. We had to get connected to ass kickers, people we consider allies in the kind of movement of social change. We needed strong leadership. It took me to make sure that we got it through. We had to create a conversational culture where we talked things out, tried to figure it out, told a lot of stories, 1 story, 2 stories, 10, 20. By the time we got to 100, we could feel what was actually bubbling up. And we took that long horizon. Go ahead, April, and skip forward. So this is where you can get more information. The story today I just wanted to share was one of letting go of these institutional assumptions, which is, to me, the key component. How do you do it? You got to challenge everything you've been thinking about. Your institution is not the center of existence. It should be community as the center, with the institution nurturing that and making that possible. Right. These days we give project budgets to families of children with disabilities, and we let them decide what they want to do in their own neighborhoods with nothing but coffee once a month with me to check in. We have people with disabilities tell us what they want to do through creative project connecting work, and they launch amazing ideas, and they do quilt guilds, and they start bike rides in their neighborhoods, and it's nothing we would have ever told them to do. We had to discover it alongside them. So it's all about getting ourselves out of the way and then putting the person and their families and their communities at the center of the efforts, and then kind of walking softly, being aware of the impact of our efforts, if that makes sense. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Tim. Wow, that was a lot. That was fantastic. All right, so John McKnight, ABCD movement co-founder, very happy to hear from you.
Yes, this is so wonderful to hear people who have this much courage and this much invention and this much trust. Oh, you're an inspiration, each of you, but also the realization that all around you were all kinds of people, motives, purposes, desires that you could bring together and really create a new way, not reform, but a new way. So thank you. That's all so wonderful. One of the things that I thought might be useful after talking with April, she said that most of the organizations in this initiative are really not focused on a particular neighborhood. Now, if you are focused on a particular neighborhood, can you show our first slide? Yeah. if you are focused on a particular neighborhood, it seems to me that it's much easier to say the community is made up of a lot of residents and neighbors. And so you can make your relationships with individuals much more easily at the neighborhood level. However, if I understand it, most of you have large areas where you need to be in touch with the community. And that's a much more difficult problem. If I'm with a zoo or a museum and I want to be in touch with the community, individuals are not likely to get me there in any broad way. So how can we begin to think about getting in touch with the community in ways that mean we're on the ground floor, we're dealing with people in their neighborhood and their civic roles? And I think the best answer we have found is that there are groups called associations. And I'd like you each to think about yourself as being in a place where you are just surrounded everywhere by groups of people, smaller groups of people, and that they're engaged in all kinds of activities that in some are critical to the building of a local community. So how do you get connected with that world that surrounds you? And one of the reasons it's a difficult question is that mostly the associational world is invisible. And so the real question is, how do we make visible this invisible world that would allow us as a citywide or regional activity to begin to really be in touch with the community, real people as they come together around the values and concerns they have. So that's what I thought might be useful for us to address. So the first question might be, well, what do you mean, John, by an association? And here are three ways of understanding what an association is. It's, you could read it yourself. I'm a little hesitant to read it to you. It's smaller face-to-face groups. They might have one paid staff member, like a secretary or an organizer or a pastor. But the key is that the members do the work, and that they are each an example of groups of local residents coming together with their gifts. And with that, they then have the capacity to set forth a vision and combine those gifts in order to make the vision come true. And incidentally, that's what a citizen is. A citizen is somebody who has the power to join with others in creating a vision for a better life and together producing that result. So let's look at the next one. Here is an example of the kinds of local associations that exist in most cities and neighborhoods, and you can see the variety there. See the second one. So there are all kinds. One of the things that we need to remind ourselves of is none of these are agencies. None of these are groups who are paid. This is underneath the agency institutional world. It is the infrastructure of community. It is where citizens come together to share their gifts and their visions. So these are the kinds of groups in your town, city, region that exist in great proliferation. Let's see the next one. So looking at a small town and then a big city neighborhood, I thought it'd be useful to see, well, what is there in a small town? Now, we were involved in some research in a small town in Wisconsin. It has about 1,600 people. And this is a list of, are they all on this list?
No, we've got this one.
Okay. All right, so here you have 1,600 people. Now there are in the rural areas around it about 3,000 more people. So we're talking about 4,600 people. What the neighbors who did this research found was that in this rural area, in the town and the surrounding area, that they could find 80 associations that people belong to. And they are just so various. You can see yourself the wide range of kinds of groups, including groups such as Mew Haven that tries to take care of stray cats and find them new homes. It's amazing once you begin to understand and see and become visible to you what the associational base. It's telling you also, what do people care about? What are they interested in? What leads them to leave the television set and come together face to face with each other? So in a way, it is one of the best ways of knowing what people care about, if you know about the associations that people belong to around you. So this is, let's see the second of the spring green ones.
Let's see, that's the second
one. Yeah. So there are all the kinds of associations that if you were in that town, 1,600 people within the town, about 450 families, and what they're surrounded by is 80 associations. Now, maybe you are not dealing with small towns or rural areas, supposing you're dealing with cities. Every place in a city is just replete with people who are together in associations. And an example of this would be, if you go to the next one, Grand Boulevard, a neighborhood in Chicago. And there, a group of neighbors decided to try to do an inventory of the associations that they could find. The neighborhood's a big one, 60,000 people, so it could be a town for that matter. And here are the kinds of associations that they found people belonging to in this neighborhood of 60,000. They found 319 associations. And that's not to say that that's all of them. We know that's not all of them, because breaking through the invisibility of the associational world means you can always find more and more. And these are the ones with names. It doesn't include all the kinds of gatherings people are involved in, but they just don't name it. I've been playing poker with a group of 9 other men for 37 years. And it's a pretty significant group in my life. And I think we, in the long range, do a lot of good, but we don't have a name. So you couldn't find us. These are just the groups that have names, but it's all you need if you really want to begin to get connected in that world. April, can we see some more?
Mm-hmm.
So you can just pass on through them, give people an idea. Right there, let's stop. Now, people are also sometimes focused on subgroups. They're interested in groups that might be categorized by age or race, whatever. At least in this neighborhood, these associations are the members are almost all African American. So we know that in any community, defined however you want to define them as a subcategory, there will be all kinds of associations. And also all kinds of associations often interested in a particular subcategory. So all around you, you're surrounded by associations that represent the gateway for an institution that has any kinds of desires to connect with the community. Here is the way that you could really do it at a larger scale, which most of you, I think, are involved in. Now, I think April sent you all before before we got together here, a booklet called Pediatrician's Guide to, it's called New Tools for Child Health, a Pediatrician's Guide to Local Associations. And after we're finished here, if you didn't look at it already, I'd encourage you to look at it. Let me tell you how it came about. The American Academy of Pediatrics to get its pediatricians to take initiatives in local areas where they were to get the community to do more things that would promote child health in the community itself, not just in the doctor's office. And what they found was that the pediatricians, usually they give them a little grant to do this, and what they would do is circle themselves with institutional actors, with the police department, the school department, the health department, so that they were always at the institutional rather than the associational level. And they did an evaluation and found that most of the things that these interagency connections that pediatricians created didn't really have much consequence. So they said to us, how could a pediatrician get in touch with the associational community where we think is much more likely that something can get done? And so we prepared this very simple guide that you now all have. It's gone to 13,000 pediatricians, all of them belong to the American Academy of Pediatrics. But it serves exactly the purpose for them that it could for you. Here's a simple way to go about initially identifying a group of associations from which you might, that makes them visible, and you might begin to say, how now do I work in this world, that this is a way I can be in touch with the community. And let me also, so I have here, this, there's a city in British Columbia called Prince George. Vancouver's the southern city. Prince George is the northern city. It's 90,000 people. And they became convinced that they were a city where all the really important things were happening by associations, not necessarily the businesses or the agencies of the government. So if they could identify them and make a directory of them, then people who wanted to really be in touch with the community would know how to do that. And so I'm holding up the directory that they produced. And this directory goes on and on. Every page has 3 or 4 associations, what name of the association is, what they do, how you can get in touch with them. There are about 1,120 associations in the book. If there is any interest anybody has in this world that isn't represented by one of the associations there, I'd be very surprised. So it gives you both substantively, geographically, and collectively a way of being in touch with the community. So the Pediatrician's Guide is a way for you to get started. It's simple, and I think it would be very revealing. Now, the other thing that we've learned, I thought would be worth sharing with you, is that just because you know the name of association, you don't know what they're doing. I mean, you might say, here's the Women's Sodality of St. Mary's Church, but in fact, that tells you nothing about what they do. And that is true of a lot of associations. So we've helped in some neighborhoods to go to a group of associations and ask them what they're doing beyond what the name sounds like they're doing. And here, for example, 21 neighborhood organizations in that neighborhood, the big urban neighborhood. They took a sample of 21 neighborhood organizations and they said to them, here are a series of things that would be good for the community. Are you doing any of those things? And if you look at neighborhood beautification, for instance, 10 of the 21, almost half, say, yes, we are. But 6 say, we aren't, but I know we would be if anybody asked us. And 5 say, I'm uncertain, I'd have to check with the board, but I think we would be. And so what this reveals is what kinds of activities these groups are really involved in. And that second column is so important. These are people who are waiting to be asked what they would be willing to do. So you want to show the second one? Okay, and here's another kind of list of things people say they are doing or would be willing to do. So supposing you knew, and supposing that what you understood was the rich associational world around you, that they're doing a lot of things you didn't know they were doing by their name, and they may be waiting to do a lot of things that you would like them to do. So in conclusion, let me suggest a couple of things that you might do once you enter the associational world. And that is, you could, after you use the Pediatrician's Guide, you have some associations, go and sit down with people and ask, I think, essentially 2 questions of an association. How can we support you? How can we support you? You are the center of society. We are interested in our possibilities of making you stronger. And then the second question is, what do you know that we could share with others? And the third one is, now we have some things we'd like to know about what you know about us and what you have experience with us. And we have some things that we think you might be able to help us with. So let us give you that list too. And out of this discussion, we'll begin to have a balance of what it is that we could do to support you, and then what it is that you could do that would support us. Another thing you could do is convene a lot of associations at one time and get a discussion going around those questions collectively. And finally, I encourage a special focus on neighborhood associations and getting in touch with neighborhood associations that are in touch with a lot of individuals. And in many towns and cities, there's an association of neighborhood associations that might be the vehicle by which you could begin to touch down. So in summary, you're surrounded by associations that are the community in the real world. They can be identified fairly easily, and most of them are waiting to hear from you. You're not intruding, and they would like to know what you could do for them, and then they would also be willing to respond to the question, what they can do for you. It's a wonderful world out there if you see the community, not just as individuals or institutions, but as a rich, rich field of association. So thanks.
Thank you so much, John. Tim, I wanted to just say I'm always so moved by how relentless you guys were in self-reflecting all along the way with your story. And I love the, I hadn't seen that, what was it, the hospice and the midwife comparison with the theory U. I really, really like that, and the idea of letting go of the old with that, with respect. What was it, gently and respectfully?
Yeah. That's the key to it. It'll create a kickback if you do it any other way.
Mm-hmm. Well, it looks like everyone. Oh, Lisa, I need to unmute you.
Yep. All right. No, I just wanted to say I was glad to see, too, in Tim's presentation, trauma-informed care is a very important area now, not only of research, but of practice and application in all kinds of sectors. So if folks haven't read up on trauma-informed care, that would be, I think, really helpful to looking at people. We are aware that we work with the Saginaw Chippewa Indian tribe in our area, and we believe we'll be working with them on their second opioid conference. And one of their major issues is that people come in to treatment through their court system because they get arrested for overdosing. And I think trauma-informed care really shifts that idea of having compassion for addicts and not treating them as criminals, but really adopting an asset-based approach to working with them is how can we help you get into treatment based on the strengths that you have. And so it's really a huge shift in medicine and social work and what I want to say, criminal justice systems. So it's really, I think, been helpful for people. I know it's now part of our curriculum in the medical school, so our medical students understand when they see somebody who presents in an exam room that some of the diseases that might present probably are from some level of childhood trauma. And we're just beginning to understand the connection between trauma and diseases, that it manifests itself in hypertension, diabetes, asthma, all kinds of different things that we never really understood before. So I was just glad to see trauma-informed care mentioned.
It's, to me, Lisa, thanks. It's actually, it's just it's an evolution, or rather a reframing, a scientific reframing of asset-based community development. I mean,
yes.
all trauma-informed care is about affirmation, that the things that happen to us we're ashamed of, or we create this internal story of we're bad or we're not good enough. And the brilliance of John's approach is that you are good enough. Not only that, we need you desperately, and that goodness has to come out. And here's what I noticed about your goodness. I mean, a simple step toward trauma healing is just to, instead of saying, how are you, you say, it's good to see you. So you affirm the person's presence right away, right? And that's all asset-based community development has ever been, is affirming the goodness of the community, affirming the goodness of relationships and of people. The one thing that I would caution, this is just our way of processing, but my wife Bridget works here as well, and she's studied it. The two books are Body Keeps the Score, and the other one is Growing Up Again. Those are our two favorites. And I would just encourage people to not let trauma become too clinical. From our perspective, trauma does happen to everyone, some people more acutely than others. But if you could imagine us making trauma into an institution.
I know.
Now we actually would use people's hurts to create clients out of them, right? And I actually am really concerned. I see that happening in the trauma world, where all of a sudden now there's trauma counselors popping up, and now even they talk about retelling your stories in your mind creates the trauma again, because you experience it almost in your mind of what happened to you. So our approach, if you noticed, I talked about the resiliency factors, which is the way out of trauma.
Right.
I don't really go for much of what happened to you specifically. I like to assume that trauma has happened and then move in spite of it, so we don't monetize trauma. That's a big no-no to me.
Right.
Maybe the same mistake. We monetize disability. The homeless people not monetize homelessness. The foster kid machine monetizes foster kids. Well, if we monetize trauma, that's got a double thing. The thing that is making my purpose is my hurts, you know, and that's exploited then for business purposes is just kind of messed up.
Right. No, I agree. And as a matter of fact, one of the, quote, tools that people use in trauma-informed care is the ACEs scale, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And to me, I think we need to be very careful with an ACEs scoring, because it's a needs assessment of a person.
Exactly.
All it does is score their trauma.
Yep.
And we fall right back into that needs thing, and defining people by their needs and their trauma instead of their resiliency paths. So I completely understand what you're saying, too.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you all so much.
Thank
Really
you.
wonderful to hear your stories, but thank you.
Thank you, April.